My name's Steve Hale with Triton Environmental, and here in Grand Junction, Colorado. Today we've got a real special presentation on NutraFix. That's a product that real excited about for cheatgrass management. So we have the developer of that today with us from Montana, Stuart Jennings. As I started mentioning, today we have representation, a wide range of folks on public lands management, from BLM to U.S. Forest Service, USDA, NRCS, USGS, the state CPW, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Department of Mine Reclamation and Safety, Colorado State Forest Service, Extension, COGCC perhaps, and also some conservation districts. So we have a wide range of folks that are interested in, and that's what's really exciting, is that we are all on a common mission here to help have tools available to us for natural resource management, and especially the ever-growing concern on rangeland management. So this is a very timely topic. Working with Triton, it's very exciting to bring this innovation to market for cheatgrass management. Also, we have ACF West here today. We have Brent Hardy, soil scientist, and Aaron Schmidt, manager for ACF West, and they help bring the product to manufacturing and logistics. They're here as well to answer questions. I wanted to introduce Stuart Jennings. He's 30 plus years doing reclamation research, mostly in Montana. He had 20 plus years working with Montana State University, doing a lot of the teaching of this technology. Undergraduate work in geology, and really focused his education on the geochemical processes in mine soils. So that's his background. And with that, he's now developed several patents and been awarded several patents for the micronutrient fertilization process that really helps with vegetation management. He is now a founder and business developer of NutraFix, working with ACF West and now partnering with us, Triton, to help get this product out into the market. So we want to welcome Stuart. I really appreciate your time today, Stuart, and we'll let you take the show from here.
Okay, off we go. Thank you for that nice introduction, Steve, and thanks to ACF for being on the call. I would like to talk to you today about an unusual strategy for promoting the growth of perennial grasses to outcompete weeds, and with special emphasis on annual grasses. So the format of our webinar today, and rest assured I've been through plenty of webinars, as we all have over the past year of crazy COVID. I'll try to keep this interesting and try to keep it moving. I've got 37 slides. I hope to run through those in a half hour or so and leave us 15 minutes at the end to have a Q&A session and be done in an hour. So Steve introduced our NutraFix team. ACF is essentially the manufacturer. Triton is the West Slope, Colorado distributor. I am a NutraFix and R&D startup with a mission to develop soil-based technologies for promoting growth of desirable perennial plant species, and NutraFix is our first product and is licensed to ACF West. So to start with, let me ask the question, and we have all had this or similar questions. Where do weeds grow? We have all come across fence lines where there were weeds on one side and not on the other, or slopes that supported one species and didn't support another. And it's never really easy to say why the plants grow in one particular location versus another. What is clear is that we have been very successful in creating soil system that is very conducive to cheatgrass. So as much as we'd all like to be mad at cheatgrass, we need to celebrate its adaptability to the soils we have created for it. So what if we change that soil chemistry using a naturally occurring mineral so that the late successional plant community thrived and the invasive plants didn't? How would we do that? How long would it last? How effective is it? Those are the basic core tenets of the next half hour or so of conversation. We're going to have a Greek lesson today, and many of you know the word edaphic. My company name, NutraFix, is a spin from that, clearly, technology for creating nutrient-dense and healthy soil. So I'd like to start with a basic question: does this product actually work? And I have been with you on this journey of watching various technologies come and go with fanfare and promise for dealing with cheatgrass, whether they're fungal, microbiological, sugar, herbicidal. I'm a preacher's son, so I can't tell a lie. So my basic answer is, does this work? Yes. So what you're looking at here is a pasture. This is Montana rangeland on private land, and the right side was treated a year earlier. This photo is from May of 2020. The left side is untreated, and if you look at the inset photos in the lower left and lower right, the annual grass still dominates the left side, and the rancher on the right-hand side in the cowboy boots is more than a little bit shocked. And there's a great quick story. He's the new ranch manager, and when he came to work there, he saw that there was a treatment using fertilizer in their cheatgrass pasture, and he kind of rolled his eyes and said, "Oh God, this is some harebrained thing I inherited," and from the previous manager. And it turned out to be just the opposite. He was and has been a great collaborator and is super excited about the results. How did we do that? Well, we filled up a hopper cart from the fertilizer plant and we spread it on the pasture in May of 2019. So it was early in the growing season. You can see the incipient green of the cheatgrass coming up in that photo, as well as the 2018 cheatgrass litter. And this is what it looked like last summer. So we went back and monitored, and I have some typical treated and untreated frames here. So we basically have 54% perennial grass cover in the treated pasture and 5% annual grass cover after 1 year. As you look at the upper untreated photo, I added in the upper right, you see there are two arrows, and it depends on your screen resolution, but the perennial grasses are visible in that photo. There are two leaf blades that are bright green that are in that untreated photo. So even though it looks like all cheatgrass, there are some perennial grasses there. I think this is thick spike wheatgrass. In the lower photo, the treated plots, you can see all the previous year's cheatgrass is gray and flat on the ground. And in the lower left corner, you can see we still do have a little bit of cheatgrass in the treated plot. However, we were super happy about how this turned out. And this is the hope for this treatment, is that it essentially empowers the perennial grasses to outcompete the cheatgrass. How do you apply the product? However you want to is kind of the basic answer, because it's fertilizer and it can be applied dry, it can be applied as a liquid. There's no barrier to technology adoption from the product and the application side of this. The annual grass problem hardly merits any repeating to the audience we have on the phone today. We all know what an intractable problem it is in the Western US. It's been called a 100 million acre problem. The wildfire linkage is clear: lost ag production, wildlife habitat, reduced carbon sequestration, and a general lack of treatment options. So as a scientist, I don't represent this as a cure-all that's perfect. I would like to represent this as a new tool in the toolbox. Again, this is kind of a review slide for our audience. Perennial grasslands, what we've got. We have a degraded vegetation condition across the Western US that is linked to a degraded soil condition. And the consequences of that are epic wildfires, diminished wildlife habitat, and unhealthy soils. So instead of having organic matter in the soil, we have CO2 release into the atmosphere. We have the development of platy soil structure and accentuated runoff rather than granular soil structure and infiltration. So the soils become droughier. Clearly a problem that is not easily fixed by any of our existing approaches. So what we want is abundant and diverse native perennial vegetation. We want stabilization from runoff. So you can see in my lower left graphic, I'm showing infiltration going into the soil, and I'm showing a thin organic soil layer with CO2 from the atmosphere going into the soil rather than being released. Lower fire frequency, better wildlife habitat. We all want this. The question is, are there any tools that we have that can drive us this direction? And that is the nature of today, is to suggest we are working hard on bringing a new tool. So about this Adafix business, what we know, and we all learned this in college, plants require macronutrients, NPK, as well as CalMag, sodium, boron, copper, zinc, iron, manganese, molybdenum, and chlorine. In my academic experience, there was a whole lot of talk about NPK and not really so much about the micronutrients. So they represent kind of an underrepresented topic as it relates to rangeland health. Every plant species clearly has unique nutritional requirements. Land disturbances across the West has resulted in soil damage, including reduced OM and nutrients. Invasive plants, and especially annual grasses, disrupt ecological processes and are harmful to wildlife. Fire frequency and intensity is increasing in part due to annual grasses. Okay, so we're all on the same sheet of music. The discovery is that healthy soils supporting late successional plant species have elevated levels of non-nitrogen fertility compared to disturbed soils. So if you flip open your laptop and you go to Google Scholar and you type in cheatgrass and fertilizer, you'll find quite a few publications about not using fertilizers in cheatgrass affected rangeland. And if you open any of those publications, you'll find they're talking about nitrogen fertilizer. In this presentation, I'm not talking about nitrogen fertilizer. Rather, I'm talking about micronutrient fertilization. So those same late successional plants that we like, coincidentally, thrive in those soils with elevated levels of micronutrients. So we're essentially promoting soil health by restoring lost nutrients. It's kind of like like our public identifies with the concept of old growth forests. I like to tell them there's also something known as an old growth grassland. And you can't have an old growth forest without the old growth soil, and you can't have an old growth grassland without the old growth grassland chemistry. So we're essentially invoking that late successional nutrient rich, parentheses, non-nitrogen, nutrient rich soil chemistry by fertilization. So these healthy soils allow perennial plants to stay green longer, have increased infiltration, increased carbon capture, and outcompete invasives, resulting in reduced fire hazard. So if you think about this from a dose response point of view, this is kind of, if you look at the y-axis, it says plant health ranging from poor to robust. And on the x-axis, we have a hypothetical gradient of nutrient levels from 0 to 10. So if you go to 5, those would be the optimal nutritional requirements for a hypothetical perennial grass plant. If you go to the bottom, you can see I've identified a green zone as a perennial native plant growth zone. Well, you don't want to have too much micronutrients because they can be phytotoxic and the domain of specialty plants. And I worked many years in the reclamation business at mine sites with elevated levels of copper and zinc and arsenic and cadmium and lead. And in the case of what I'll call true contaminants like lead and arsenic and cadmium and nickel, you want 0 in your plants, you want 0 in your microbrew, you want 0 in your soil. But when it comes to the micronutrients, it's kind of interesting when a Superfund site has iron and copper and zinc listed as contaminants, because it's not really that they're poisonous or toxic to plants because they are that element. They are toxic because of the level. Flipping to the other limb of the dose response curve, you see the disturbed sites that I have labeled as deficient with a little blue symbol that says you are here. And I would like to suggest that that is the basic fertility level in soils in the Western US, is they are deficient in micronutrient fertility. So this talk is about raising that fertility level from 3 to 5. How would we approach this deficiency if we were doing regenerative agriculture? My basic response is all of these same minerals are soluble in organic acids associated with dissolved organic carbon. So in a naturally functioning system with higher levels of OM, and that's what the regenerative ag guys are doing, is they are trying to increase the amount of OM in their A horizon. And one of the main functions that serves is stimulating the soil microbiology, which releases dissolved organic carbon, which is the fuel for microbes. And those are also organic acids, because the total amount of these minerals is not deficient in the soil. It is the plant available fraction. So it is those organic acids that come with organic matter that lead to the dissolution and mobilization of micronutrients in a healthy soil. So if we do one more dose response curve here, this is a comparison of two hypothetical plant types, weeds and desirables. So imagine those desirables are native plants like blue bunch wheatgrass. If you have a nutrient level of 5 milligrams per liter on this hypothetical scale, you're going to have a plant community that's dominated by weeds because of the edaphic factors. In other words, low nutrition. If you can somehow raise those desirable species, raise the nutrient levels up to the desirable species zone, say 10 to 15 milligrams per liter, the weeds are not going to thrive in that geochemical condition. So we're trying to do that. So we have two basic strategies. One is to increase the amount of organic carbon in the soil, and that's really hard to do and really expensive. The other, I won't call this approach cheap, is to invoke that nutrient level by adding it out of a fertilizer bag. We respect that every plant species has its own dose response curve and own unique nutrient requirement. Certainly the weeds like the low micronutrient fertility, and we're trying to invoke the later successional plants, their own allelopathic ability to fight off weedy invaders. And allelopathy is a totally natural battle between plants. We're just trying to weaponize the perennial plants so they can have the resources they need to fight off their invaders. So thinking about the soil solution, and this graphic shows a nutrient solution, the soil solution is essentially what plants drink. So if we use blue bunch wheatgrass and we say the full nutrient spectrum is our big healthy blue bunch plant, and if we have deficient phosphorus, we may have weak shoots. If we have deficient magnesium, we may have poor growth and yellow leaves. If we have deficient iron, we have yellowish leaves. If we have deficient nitrogen, we have very little growth. Or if the soil solution is essentially lacking in cations, so that's kind of the distilled water sand example, you're going to have hardly any plant growth. So the soil solution is essentially the same as this hydroponic example shown here. It's the soluble minerals that dissolve in rainwater and are mobilized by microorganisms and fungi that cause the plants to grow. So if we look at some real data, my data unpublished, so these are saturated paste extracts where you essentially take a soil sample, you mix it with deionized water, you let it sit on the countertop overnight, and then you use vacuum to pull the water off of that soil, and then the laboratory analyzes that extract to tell you what's in the soil. So in my healthy rangeland example, I have 2% OM, modest salinity, alkaline pH, not sodic. And in my depleted rangeland soil, I have much less OM, about the same level of salinity, pH, and sodicity. And the key thing to take away from this is that many of our Western soil solutions are dominated by calcium. Fortunately, all of our native plants love that calcium-rich soil and they thrive in it. And if you start looking for nutrients, like N, P, and K, you can see they are relatively small wedges in this. And as it relates to this talk, there's a little tiny wedge in the upper graph that is the sum of all the micronutrients, and it's absent from that depleted rangeland soil. So from an NutraFix or NutraFix point of view, we're trying to replace that little tiny wedge, just like when you take a multivitamin in the morning that has iron and manganese and copper and zinc in it, you're trying to replace what you don't get of those minerals from your diet. We're trying to do the same for the soil. Here's what the treatment looks like when it's installed. There was not a hailstorm overnight. This is essentially a spring grassland photo, and the small pellets you see, the little white spots, those are individual fertilizer granules. So as fancy as this technology sounds, it's really simple. We're putting fertilizer on the ground and waiting for it to rain. And this is what the cheatgrass often looks like in that first growing season. This is my favorite way that I like to see cheatgrass, and you have to get on your hands and knees and look. But those leaves are chlorotic, the plants are not healthy. And if you look closely, these seeds have tried, there's an older brownish desiccated first generation of leaves. Those were the first leaves that grew and failed. And so the chlorotic ones are the second generation. So the cheatgrass is trying hard to get started, and this is where seed production stops. So when do you apply this? Well, ideally late summer, early fall in advance of germination, because annual grasses germinate in the fall, typically in response to fall precip. The next best time to apply is now in the late winter, early spring. Since this treatment is a soil-based granular treatment, you can really put it on anytime. But if you put it down in May when the cheatgrass has already headed out and produced seed, you're going to have to wait until fall before you see any plant response, because the plant is essentially grown to maturity. So you have to be patient if you apply it when the cheatgrass is headed out, because it's going to be a while before that seed falls to the ground and germinates. We do have a liquid product that's best timed with the growth of perennial vegetation, so spring and fall. Where do you apply it and how much does it cost? So this is kind of a low, medium, high perspective. Rangeland areas at risk of becoming invaded by weeds would be a low rate with a low cost. Moderate amounts of perennial vegetation would be a moderate rate and a moderate cost. High amounts of invasive plants and low amounts of perennial vegetation would be a high rate and a high cost. And these costs are typically several $100s per acre, but it's driven by application rate, product delivery cost, volume, etc. My suggestion is the best way to determine your rate is to put out a set of test plots and see how they do. And then if you're doing a large area, wait to see the response from that initial trial. We do have a base rate that is in that higher range that is highly effective. One of our difficult areas is where there's no desirable perennial vegetation and heavy plant litter and low rainfall. And I'd add to that sandy soils with no organic matter. How many applications are required? One. My goal with this has been to have this be a one and done kind of a treatment. The photo pair shown here, this is a highway road cut in Montana. It was treated, I believe it was fall of 2016. So I'm through 4 growing seasons. This summer will be the 5th growing season, and it has less than 10% cheatgrass cover. You can see the untreated. This photo was from the 3rd growing season, and I show it because that year the cheatgrass turned bright red. So it made for a really nice comparison of the green perennials versus the red cheatgrass. And what I draw your attention to is not so much the cheatgrass, but the amount of perennial grass on this south-facing slope in a soil that had no, the slope had, when they redid the road, they did not replace the cover soil. So this is growing in sandy, terrible parent material. And even so, the native plants there have filled in where the cheatgrass previously existed when we put the treatment down. So this is not a story so much about excluding cheatgrass as it is growing perennial grasses. So soil health is at the core of this conversation. USDA, I think there's some USDAers on the call. I love this graphic showing the emphasis on rooting. Here we have sagebrush, sandbird bluegrass, lupin, buckwheat, blue bunch, thick spike, and there's a little puny cheatgrass on the right. The story is conserve our western roots. And I totally agree with that. And if you look at cropping systems, there are a lot of scholarly publications about soil health in ag systems. And that has a lot to do with trying to sequester carbon and improve carbon stores in the soil. As a matter of fact, there's a publication that's out in the past days, remote sensing work done in the Corn Belt in the US, saying that 35% of our Corn Belt soils are basically being grown in the B horizon now, and that the tops of ridges are now showing up on sat images as light tan instead of as dark brown organic matter. So we have a societal challenge coming in cropping systems as well as the rangeland systems we're talking about today. So I adapted NRCS's beautiful graphic to say, how did we end up in this cheatgrass box? And so I captured some of those same plants and showed them in healthy rangeland soil, and notice the thickness of the organic horizon in that soil. It's thick. And then through some disturbance, the topsoil thins and the cheatgrass comes in, and the first thing to disappear are the pollinators. The lupin and the buckwheat are gone. Disturbance can be defined. We all know intuitively what some of these are. There are things like fire and climate change and high intensity grazing and roading and tilling. There are many ways to end up in this disturbance box, and I choose to be agnostic about pointing fault. It's just a matter of fact, is this is where we are, because if you go to the third panel, continuing disturbance, there's more cheatgrass and there's less organic soil. By the time you get to the fourth panel, you have cheatgrass dominance and little tiny rangeland plants and heavy fire risk. So now we want to run this in reverse. How can we fix this? So if we take this severely degraded rangeland, we're going to apply the NutraFix treatment shown in blue in this photo. And in the third panel, you can see there is less cheatgrass. There's still some. The perennial plants are taller in stature. The amount of organic matter is growing because organic matter is essentially formed from those deep roots, those deep-rooted plants that we have lost on severely degraded land. And you can see there's some kind of purple shadowing in the soil. That is that bluish purple, quote unquote, NutraFix signature. And then over time, we can run this in reverse back to our healthy rangeland with lower fire frequency. So my tenet is to have a healthy plant community, we have to have a healthy soil, and that includes adequate levels of macro and micronutrients to keep the system in balance. And fundamental to you only have to apply this product once, is that the inputs and outputs of nutrients are in balance. It's like a bank account. If you think of the organic matter as the balance in your bank account, you have to add to that as much as you withdraw every year. So this goes to grazing management and fires and extractive uses of our soil resource. We have to rebuild that organic horizon, and then we have to manage it sustainably. Fortunately, there's plenty of CO2 in the atmosphere available to us for this endeavor. So I have been doing test plots, and I want to talk about some of those plots here. I'd be remiss if I didn't show you some examples, and I'm not a good salesman, so I'm going to fall back on data. So this Wyoming example, if you look at the upper left square, clearly something happened between those four stakes. We applied a micronutrient solution, and what I draw your attention to is that there are still green plants growing inside that square. Those are the perennial grasses. So this approach is not harmful to the perennial grasses, quite the opposite. They like the nutrients, and secondarily, they like the availability of additional soil resources, because if the cheatgrass isn't drinking up all the water in the top 2 inches of soil, you can have deep infiltration, and that keeps the perennial grasses green later in the season. It gives them more resources when they're trying to flower and produce seed. Clearly, I have plots in Montana. This is data from Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. I helped the biologist, Vanna, put out plots in 2017, and she did the monitoring in 2018, 19, and 20. So this is a 3-year story. So these are her data. And we had 3 plots. So if you look at the upper graph, those are essentially the green series represents perennial grass cover. The orange series represents cheatgrass cover. And it's probably easiest to look at the lower right graph because I took the average of those 3 plots just to kind of give you an index. So when we installed these plots, we had 23% perennial grass cover. In the first growing season, we had 37%, 57% in the second growing season, 75% in the third growing season. And cheatgrass was the reciprocal, 67% to start with, 33% the first growing season, 17% the second, and 11% the third. So this time series is kind of typical, is that the treatment tends to get better over time. And thinking about cheatgrass seed as having maybe a 4-year life cycle in the soil, this is how we deplete the seed bank of the cheatgrass soil and at the same time promote the growth of the perennials. Here's another Montana example that I shouldn't be too long-winded on because I really like this story. This is an island in the middle of Flathead Lake, and it has the distinction of being where they found the largest dead bighorn sheep in the history of that species. So all the hunters and wildlife professionals have been really excited about this island, and it's a state-owned land that they manage for wildlife. There's a no hunting area. So all the transplants of bighorn sheep in Montana essentially come from this island. Well, they're worried that this is rangeland analysis platform data showing sort of a slowly decreasing cover of perennial grasses and a slowly increasing cover of annual grasses going back to 1984. So we put out a series of plots there in several different rates and several different habitat sites. So this is the first growing season. Our worst site, cheatgrass went from 91% to 5% in the first growing season, and perennial grasses increased from 3 to 10%. Our moderate annual grass site went from 18% to 4%, and perennials increased from 5 to 9%. We went back last summer to do a second year of monitoring, and that trend has continued. The dark green bars in this photo are the second growing season perennial grass cover amounts. So this is low, medium, and high application rates. So the higher the rate of application, the higher the mean cover of perennial grass. And during that time, perennial grasses on the untreated have remained below 5%. So we are now at, say, 15, 25, and 35% cover on the treatment areas. We're a little too late to see the arrowleaf balsam root, but this is a beautiful south-facing slope and covered with wildlife. So to jump to Utah, we're going to get drier now. My colleague Kevin invited me to do some plots here at Coldwater Wildlife Management Area, where he has been doing research, primarily using various herbicides. And you can see with the herbicide treatments, they've been effective in controlling the annual grasses at this site. They have been drill seeding this and had essentially zero success. So their perennial grass cover, typically a few percent in the herbicide treated areas. In my plot area, something shocking happened. In the first growing season, they were invaded by blue bunch wheatgrass. As crazy as that sounds, I swear I'm not photoshopping this. This is the actual results, and Kevin would vouch for me if he was on the call. We had no idea there was so much blue bunch seed apparently in the seed bank here. So this treatment had a surprising effect on germination of apparently dormant blue bunch. And his thought was that 10 or 20 years ago, this site had been seeded with blue bunch. It also has some alfalfa in it. So I was suspicious it had been seeded at one point. So that's quite an interesting story. Bouncing to West Slope of Colorado, coming closer to home for our audience today. These are plots implemented by my colleague Danielle, who's on the call today. The top row of photos are all from the same site. So this is a seeding and pitting trial comparing the Adafix NutraFix product to plateau herbicide. I'll talk more about that on the next slide. The one, I know fires are a big issue for people on the call. This is just a small 100 square foot plot Danielle put out. And I love the photo pair in the lower right because she found the same plant species growing on and off the plot. And she was taken, as am I, how green the perennial grass cover was when the cheatgrass cover was reduced. So even in a dry place like Grand Junction, cheatgrass control has a remarkable effect on increasing the greenness, and I'm hoping that has companion reductions in flammability associated with product. So here's another page of Danielle's story. By full disclosure, and we can talk more about this, the reason the Adafix plots look so beautiful and lush and green is that they have been taken over by Russian thistle. We're viewing that as a step in the right direction from a successional point of view, though clearly we'd like to see the seeded species coming on. They have been in drought. As it relates to cheatgrass and weedy cover, reading from Danielle's report, product treatment had large effects on the plant community. Cover of invasive perennial bulbous bluegrass was lower in the NutraFix plots than in the plateau plots, 6.3% in NutraFix, 21% in plateau. NutraFix drill seeded plots differed from controls in bulbous bluegrass cover. Also, drill seeded plots did not. So this is a site where we have had a sharp decline in the cheatgrass, just as we would have hoped. And maybe the more remarkable thing is that the cheatgrass has been replaced by the Russian thistle. So I have been working at other sites. I can make little squares on the ground clearly. I want to make sure you get the idea that this technology works in many different climates and many different locations. And we're still discovering kind of the envelope of places where this works. I should mention this also can be applied as a liquid. Granular product is our go-to. I did this at a friend's place kind of as a joke. I had marker dye in the fertilizer, so I put an EDX on the soil, and then next spring you can clearly see that the cheatgrass didn't like that. So to leave some time for questions, it's about 1:45. My conclusions are this technology is effective. It's made from naturally occurring minerals, providing micronutrients and a small amount of poultry manure with NPK. It's easily applied, long-lasting, cost-reasonable, restores soil fertility, and promotes the growth of perennial grasses. This is my contact info slide. Steve, who you heard from earlier, our moderator, his phone and email, and Brent and Michael from ACF West. So with that said, that was kind of a whirlwind. Thanks for hanging with me. I hope you found that interesting. I would like to relinquish control and go back to Steve.
Fantastic. Stuart, that was just really neat to go through that presentation and get it straight from you. I appreciate your time on this. So we do have a few questions, and more of them are coming in now. So I'm going to hand the microphone back over to Brent, who's been tallying up some questions.
What perennials have been studied, and does it work for all of them?
Clearly, it has not been studied on all of the perennials. Like there are species with sensitivity to this, like lupin, for example. But lupin is somewhat sensitive to the high rate. I have turned lupin ugly chlorotic colors before. So it's a perennial plant and it does not like the high rate. So kind of going to every plant has its own optimum levels. Like if you were using this product in a beautiful forb-filled wildflower meadow with a tiny amount of cheatgrass, I would start out using a really low application rate. Unfortunately for me, most of the places people give me to work are places like roadsides and pastures that are ridiculous amounts of cheatgrass, and they expect miracles. The product works pretty well, surprisingly, even though there may not be a lot of perennial vegetation sometimes. I have not yet found a perennial grass that is intolerant of this treatment. And among the forbs, really most of the forbs seem to be very well adapted. And I think part of this story may be that the weedier species have more poorly developed fungal associates as mycorrhizae. So I think the mycorrhizae may serve somewhat of a regulatory role. So in like the classic story of mycorrhizae is about mobilizing phosphorus to the plant. And certainly that happens, but I think the mycorrhizae may also moderate the doses, whereas the weedier species lack that filter, and they just maybe sometimes overindulge in their micronutrients.
On to the next question. Since cheatgrass seeds stay in soils, could they reemerge once the NutraFix diminishes?
Yeah, and I think the answer is yes, that any treatment, we have to think of it as having a lifespan. And my way to answer that in a positive way is to say that once the cheatgrass seed bank is dried up, say go 4 or 5 years forward, you would have much less cheatgrass. But you're always going to have new cheatgrass seed blowing in on the wind. Cheatgrass is not going to be extirpated anytime in our lifetimes. The question is how much of the treatment is still in the soil, because the soils want to retain nutrients. Their goal is to cycle nutrients, not lose them. So if we compare two side-by-side pastures in the same soil, and one is intensively grazed to an inch of stubble every year, and the other is not, that ungrazed pasture is going to have a lot more of the original treatment still present from a mass balance point of view, because it hasn't been removed from the system. The duration with which this treatment lasts, I think it has the potential to be permanent, but it also has the potential to be depleted depending on the management.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Do you see non-native perennial grasses show the same response?
Yeah, the non-native perennials are the same as perennials. They like smooth brome, crested wheatgrass. They like this treatment. So anyone hoping for a new tool for crested wheatgrass removal will be disappointed. Don't have any efficacy with that.
Can it be applied over snow?
Have done that, yep.
And does it work with warm season grasses?
I don't have a good warm season data set. I have some occasional warm season grasses. I don't have a red flag that says that is a bad. That is probably an area where I should collect a good data set around that question.
Does treatment need to be applied before precipitation? What if no precipitation happens for weeks or months? Will the fertilizer effectiveness be diminished?
Yes, because there will be no plants with no rain. I tell a story of my friend who was the reclamation guy at the Nevada test site for many years, and they thought he was the worst employee they ever had because he put all this seed out and nothing ever grew. And then finally they had a wet spring and everything grew and he was a hero. In terms of dissolving the fertilizer, making it available to the plant, if we have no rain, we're in trouble.
The last question, and there's been several of them asking about average cost per acre. And if you'd like, Stuart, I can address that one.
Okay, that's in your domain anyway.
Yes, so ACF and Triton are the distributors of this product, and Stuart had a slide earlier on in his presentation about the cost and how they can be graduated depending on whether you're a new reclamation seeding, if you're post-fire and you don't have an existing stand of annual grasses or weeds, compared to an established site that has quite a bit of cheatgrass. So there is a range depending on what your sites look like. But on average, we're applying 350 pounds per acre. And the cost is going to be hundreds of dollars per acre to a max of about, say, 800 to 900 an acre.
You know, that's one other thing I should mention is that with the launch of this product last year, there were a lot of investigators who got test plot size quantities of product. So between universities and state and federal agencies, there is going to be, I don't know if I should call it a tidal wave, but a substantial increase in the knowledge base about this over the next year. And so some of these questions like we're asking here today, people smarter than I am are going to help tell that story over the coming years.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Stuart and ACF West, for being here. Let's see if we can tackle this range dilemma that we're in. This is a great new tool for all of us. I appreciate this chance to be together.